The Saxon tribes arose, seemingly forged by the incessant winds from the damp, marshy lowlands and the impenetrable forests of the North German plain at the dawn of the Common Era. Their genesis is deeply rooted in the complex and multifaceted tribal mosaic that defined the character of northern Germania, lying beyond the Roman limes. These Germanic communities consolidated across three pivotal yet interconnected domains: the viscous lowlands of Holstein, with its labyrinth of river valleys and coastal inlets; the rolling uplands and watery arteries of Westphalia, where the Weser and Ems rivers carved their channels toward the North Sea; and the boundless heathlands of the region that would later inherit their name, Lower Saxony. The geographical anchor of Saxon identity stretched northward, reaching into the Jutland Peninsula, where archaeological finds attest to unbroken cultural and material connections with Danish clans, thereby forming the expansive North Sea Germanic cultural sphere that became the very cradle of Saxon development. The North German plain itself presented a dual landscape, at once fertile and formidable, which fundamentally imprinted itself upon Saxon society. The region's numerous rivers, the Elbe, Weser, Ems, and their countless tributaries, served as natural highways for commerce and communication, simultaneously spawning isolated islands of settlement, separated by vast wetlands and thick forests. These natural impediments fostered the crystallization of distinct, local identities within the broad Saxon Confederation. Each group, while adapting to the specific ecological nuances of its environment, diligently preserved common cultural and linguistic bonds. Coastal territories granted access to the sea's bounty and stimulated the development of seafaring expertise that proved decisive in the subsequent Saxon expansion. In turn, the interior forests furnished timber, game, and served as unassailable defensive bulwarks against external foes. Archaeological scrutiny across Holstein has unearthed settlements dating back to the 1st century CE, demonstrating an ingenious adaptation to the complex fenland ecosystem. Excavations at sites like Feddersen-Virde have revealed elevated communities, constructed upon artificial mounds, terpen, for protection against seasonal flooding, with meticulously planned structures that included central halls encircled by smaller residential and artisan dwellings. These settlements typically accommodated between 200 and 500 inhabitants, organized into extended clan groups, which served as the foundational social units of Saxon society. Construction techniques relied upon massive timber frames, infilled with wattle and daub, creating robust structures capable of enduring the harsh North Sea climate and meeting the communal needs of these early communities. The structure of the tribal confederation, which characterized the Saxon political arrangement, represented a subtle equilibrium between regional autonomy and collective self-awareness. Unlike the centralized kingdoms that emerged significantly later, early Saxon society functioned as a network of loosely allied tribes, each retaining its own lands, leadership, and customs, while acknowledging a shared ancestry and cultural ties. This confederate model guaranteed a flexible response to threats and opportunities, allowing for the rapid mobilization of warriors from diverse tribes when collective action became unavoidable. The system also facilitated the peaceful resolution of disputes through established protocols and maintained commercial relations across tribal boundaries. The nucleus of the Saxon social order was the institution of the comitatus, a sacred brotherhood of warriors coalesced around the figure of a charismatic chieftain, serving as the very foundation of their military and political might. Primarily, young men entered these fraternities, binding themselves with a personal, unbreakable oath of fealty to their leader. These sacred vows created bonds that surpassed even blood kinship. The comitatus system offered a pathway to social ascent, enabling talented warriors to elevate their status irrespective of birth, while simultaneously weaving networks of mutual obligation and support that permeated all of Saxon society. Archaeological finds from warrior burials in the region attest to the complex culture of warfare that nourished these retinues. High-quality spears, shields, and rare swords point both to the exceptional importance accorded to martial skill and to the advanced traditions of sophisticated metalworking. The democratic principles of Saxon governance manifested through the tribal assemblies, known as the things, general gatherings, where free men could voice their opinions, settle conflicts, and participate in the decision-making processes that affected the entire community. These assemblies were traditionally convened in sacred groves or other ritually significant locations, underscoring the inseparable link between political authority and spiritual legitimacy. The thing system served as a counterweight to the power of the chieftains and aristocratic families, ensuring that key decisions required some degree of consensus from the populace. Archaeological evidence suggests that these assemblies were often accompanied by communal feasting and religious rites, solidifying social cohesion concurrently with the conduct of important public affairs. The material culture of the Roman Iron Age attests to the high standard of Saxon craftsmanship and the extensive reach of their commercial networks. Pottery production demonstrates a fusion of local traditions with the influence of Roman provincial workshops, suggesting active trade relationships despite political tensions. Metalworking achieved impressive perfection. Saxon smiths crafted not only weapons and tools, but also intricate jewelry and decorative items, showcasing a masterful command of complex techniques, including pattern welding and filigree work. The discovery of Roman coins, glass vessels, and luxury items in Saxon settlements confirms the vastness of the trade routes through which Mediterranean goods penetrated the North German plain in exchange for amber, furs, and other northern riches. The funerary rites of this period offer valuable insight into Saxon social structure and spiritual beliefs. Cremation remained the dominant practice. The ashes were typically placed in ceramic urns and interred in extensive burial fields that served many generations. The grave goods in these interments reveal a distinct social stratification. Elite deceased were laid to rest alongside weapons, jewelry, and imported luxuries, whereas common burials contained a more modest assortment of everyday objects. The presence of horse burials and stone arrangements in the shape of ships in several locations points to the significance of mobility and maritime connections in the Saxon worldview, anticipating their future renown as sea raiders and colonizers. The development of Saxon maritime capabilities became a vitally important adaptation to their coastal environment and their increasing involvement in the North Sea trade networks. Early vessels were likely simple rowing boats, suitable for riverine and coastal navigation, yet archaeological data indicates increasingly sophisticated shipbuilding methods, commencing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. The discovery of ship burials and ship-shaped memorials indicates the central role of seafaring in the Saxon identity, and the presence of foreign goods in coastal settlements proves the efficacy of their maritime trade routes. These skills proved indispensable when the Saxon tribes began to forsake their traditional territories in pursuit of new horizons. Roman chronicles provide fragmentary but valuable information about early Saxon-Roman interactions along the northern limes. The first verifiable mention of the Saxons appears in Ptolemy's geography around 150 CE, placing them in the Holstein region and confirming their status as neighbors to other well-documented Germanic tribes. Roman military dispatches of the 3rd century describe the growing involvement of the Saxons in piracy along the North Sea coast, suggesting that their naval strength had evolved to a level that threatened Roman shipping and coastal settlements. These early clashes laid the groundwork for an interaction that would characterize Saxon-Roman relations for centuries, weaving together periods of commerce and cooperation with episodes of raiding and warfare. Rome's response to Saxon maritime activity included the construction of coastal fortresses and the organization of naval patrols designed to protect provincial territories from attacks by sea. Archaeological evidence from Roman coastal forts in Britain and Gaul reveals structural modifications specifically engineered to counteract Saxon raiding tactics, including reinforced harbor fortifications and early warning systems. These defensive efforts, unintentionally for Rome, supplied the Saxon raiders with priceless intelligence regarding Roman military capabilities and coastal geography knowledge that would prove decisive in their subsequent successful incursions into Roman lands. Saxon settlement patterns during the Roman Iron Age exhibit a striking continuity with more ancient, prehistoric traditions, while simultaneously incorporating new influences from contact with the Roman world. Villages were typically situated on elevated ground near rivers or close to the coast, utilizing natural defenses while retaining access to transport routes and marine resources. The layout of these settlements reflects careful planning, with residential areas separated from artisan zones and communal buildings positioned to serve the entire community. Granaries and storage pits point to successful agricultural adaptation to the harsh northern climate, and the presence of specialized workshops attests to growing economic diversification. The religious landscape of early Saxon society represented a blend of traditional Germanic beliefs with evolving rites, reflecting their unique environmental and cultural conditions. Sacred groves, springs, and other natural features served as centers for communal worship. Archaeological data suggests the practice of ritual burial in wetlands and rivers. The discovery of votive offerings, including weapons, jewelry, and precious metals, in the bogs of the Saxon homeland, points to complex religious practices that likely served to strengthen social bonds and demonstrate communal prosperity. These spiritual traditions subsequently influenced the Saxon response to Christianity and shaped the syncretic beliefs characteristic of their conversion period. Linguistic evidence of early Saxon identity indicates a connection to the extensive West Germanic language family, while preserving distinct dialectical features that later underpinned the development of Old English. Toponymic studies in the Saxon homeland reveal consistent naming patterns that reflect their ecological adaptation and social organization, with numerous references to forest clearances, rivers, and defensive positions. The preservation of Saxon legal terminology in later written sources suggests the existence of complex concepts of property rights, community obligations, and collective responsibility that originated during this formative period. The transformation of Saxon society, its transition from settled agricultural communities to mobile warrior retinues daring to challenge Roman power across the expanse of the North Sea, began in the stormy 3rd century. Internal pressures on their ancestral lands and increasing tension along the entire Germanic limes compelled the Saxons toward a radical upheaval of their entire way of life. The relative stability that reigned in the Saxon territories during the Roman Iron Age gave way to an era of unprecedented mobility. Tribal groups found themselves squeezed between increasing populations, deteriorating climatic conditions, and the ripple effects of migrations originating far to the east. These converging forces were destined to change not only Saxon society, but the entire political landscape of Northwest Europe, as old boundaries dissolved, yielding to new forms of conflict and resettlement. The collapse of Roman border fortifications along the Rhine marked a critical watershed, opening up vast new opportunities for Saxon expansion beyond their traditional lands. The crisis of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century catastrophically weakened the military infrastructure that had previously contained the pressure of the Germanic tribes. Legions were recalled from border posts to fight in civil wars and address threats in other parts of the empire. The fortresses on the Rhine, once an impenetrable barrier supported by significant military contingents, became increasingly porous as garrison numbers dwindled and maintenance declined. Saxon contingents, initially operating as opportunistic raiders, quickly grasped this vulnerability and began coordinating larger-scale operations, exploiting the gaps in the Roman defense. The participation of the Saxons in the wide-ranging Germanic migrations of this period reflected both their increasing military strength and the rising pressure within their homeland. Archaeological evidence from settlements in Holstein and Westphalia shows a noticeable population decrease during the 3rd and 4th centuries, suggesting large-scale relocation rather than demographic collapse from war or disease. Entire communities apparently abandoned long-established sites, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and the foundations of buildings that had served many generations. This pattern of organized departure, rather than chaotic flight, points to coordinated decision-making at the tribal level and suggests that the Saxon migrations were planned responses to deteriorating conditions, rather than desperate attempts to escape immediate peril. The development of Saxon naval combat capabilities during this period was a revolutionary adaptation, transforming them from coastal raiders into a serious maritime threat across the entire North Sea basin. Vessels evolved from simple coastal craft to complex warships capable of extended operations far from their native shores. Archaeological reconstructions, based on ship finds from Nydam and other locations, show sleek, shallow draft vessels up to 75 feet in length, propelled by crews of 30 to 40 rowers, and capable of transporting a significant number of warriors with full equipment. These ships featured flexible construction techniques that allowed them to flex with the ocean swell while maintaining structural integrity, making them ideal for both riverine excursions and open sea voyaging. Saxon piracy against Roman Britain evolved from sporadic raids into a systematic enterprise. Organized flotillas conducted coordinated attacks on specific targets along the British coast. Roman sources describe Saxon raiders operating with meticulous knowledge of tidal cycles, coastal geography, and the location of wealthy settlements, suggesting extensive reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. These attacks were typically aimed at rich villas, trade hubs, and religious sites, promising both immediate plunder and strategic value. The raiders displayed striking tactical sophistication, often coordinating simultaneous strikes at multiple points along the coast to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their response. Rome's military reaction to the Saxon maritime threat led to the creation of the extensive coastal defense system known as the Saxon Shore, Litus Saxonicum. It stretched from the Wash to the Isle of Wight and beyond the English Channel, including fortifications in northern Gaul. These strongholds represented a new approach to coastal defense, distinguished by massive walls up to 20 feet thick and incorporating architectural innovations specifically designed to counteract attacks from the sea. Forts such as Richborough, Dover, and Pevensey featured protected harbors where Roman naval vessels could shelter while maintaining rapid response capabilities. Their elevated positions provided excellent sightlines for spotting approaching threats miles across the open water. The forts of the Saxon shore themselves powerfully attest to the scale of the threat posed by the Saxon raiders and the resources Rome was willing to expend to contain them. Portchester Castle, one of the best preserved examples, enclosed nearly 9 acres with walls that rose 20 feet above ground level and extended deep into the earth to prevent undermining. The fort's design included multiple defensive layers, including outer ditches, multi-barrier gates, and internal structures positioned to ensure overlapping fields of fire. Garrisons typically numbered several hundred soldiers, including both regular legionary troops and specialized naval personnel trained in amphibious warfare techniques. The recruitment of Saxon foederati, by Roman authorities was a pragmatic acknowledgement that military solutions alone could not eliminate the Saxon threat. These formal agreements enlisted Saxon contingents into Roman service as allied troops, providing them with regular pay, equipment, and legal status within the empire in exchange for military assistance against other barbarian groups. The foederati system benefited both sides. The Romans gained experienced warriors familiar with Germanic tactics and terrain, while the Saxons gained legal access to Roman territories and resources. Archaeological evidence from military sites in Britain and Gaul shows the presence of Germanic military equipment and burial customs alongside Roman material culture, indicating the deep integration of Saxon warriors into the imperial defensive structures. The internal pressures spurring Saxon migration included demographic shifts that created a mounting strain on the subsistence resources of their traditional lands. Pollen analysis from bog deposits throughout the Saxon homeland indicates an intensification of agriculture during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, with extensive forest clearance and expansion of cultivated areas, suggesting population growth that pressed against the limits of available arable land. The archaeology of settlements confirms this pattern. New villages emerged in previously marginal areas, and existing communities expanded beyond their original boundaries. The exhaustion of easily worked soils and competition for the best agricultural land created tensions within and among tribal groups, which found an outlet in migration. Climate change during the 3rd and 4th centuries exacerbated this demographic pressure, reducing agricultural productivity across northern Europe. Paleoclimatic data points to a cooling trend that shortened growing seasons and increased the frequency of crop failures. The threat of rising sea levels loomed over coastal settlements and reduced the area of productive low-lying districts. The Saxon homeland, with its extensive wetlands and marginal soils, proved especially vulnerable to these ecological perturbations. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlements reveals layers of wind-blown sand and peat accumulation, suggesting the cessation of agriculture in the face of deteriorating conditions. Pressure from the Huns and other eastern tribal movements triggered a cascade effect that ultimately reached Saxon territories through a complex chain of displacements. The westward expansion of the Huns during the 4th century dislodged the Goths and other Germanic tribes from the Black Sea region, forcing them to seek new lands further west. This displacement, in turn, put pressure on intermediate tribes, which then began to squeeze their western neighbors in a domino effect that reached the North Sea coast. Saxon groups found themselves competing not only with traditional rivals, but also with new refugees and displaced persons seeking settlement opportunities. The Hunnic influence on Saxon society was not limited to territorial pressure, but also included changes in military technology and tactics. Contact with Eastern nomadic groups led to the adoption of new weaponry, particularly improved composite bows and cavalry techniques, which influenced the development of Saxon military doctrine. Archaeological finds at 4th century Saxon sites include horse gear and weapon styles that show distinct Eastern influence, suggesting the active adoption of new martial technologies. The emphasis on mobility and rapid deployment, characteristic of Hunnic warfare, found fertile ground among the Saxon warrior bands, already adapted to amphibious operations. Saxon naval operations against Gaul exhibited the same systematic approach evident in their attacks on Britain, with raiders selectively targeting river valleys that provided access to wealthy inland settlements. The Seine, the Loire, and other major rivers became highways for Saxon penetration deep into Roman territory. Their shallow draft vessels could navigate far upstream, reaching previously secure areas. Roman sources describe Saxon flotillas advancing hundreds of miles upriver, establishing temporary bases from which they could conduct protracted raiding campaigns before retreating to the safety of the open sea. The sophistication of Saxon piracy is evident in their development of specialized tactics for various types of targets and defensive situations. Coastal raids typically relied on the suddenness of attack at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor and defenders were least prepared. Riverine operations demanded a different approach. Scouts were sent ahead to identify obstacles and defensive positions, while the main forces prepared for potential combat retreats in case of encountering superior numbers. The raiders demonstrated remarkable adaptability, modifying their tactics based on local conditions and the response of their adversaries. The economic consequences of Saxon piracy extended far beyond the immediate losses from individual raids and included widespread disruption of trade networks and coastal settlement patterns. Roman merchants increasingly avoided routes known for the frequent presence of Saxon raiders, leading to the decline of previously thriving ports and the development of alternative inland routes that were more costly and less efficient. Coastal villas, once symbols of Roman prosperity and security, were abandoned or fortified as their owners sought refuge in more defensible locations. The cumulative result was a significant decline in the economic vitality of coastal regions and an outflow of population and resources away from the sea. The response of the local population to the Saxon raids varied significantly, depending on their resources and strategic situation. Some communities attempted to negotiate protection, offering tribute or supplies in exchange for immunity from attack. Others organized local militias and constructed fortifications, though these rarely proved effective against determined Saxon assaults. The most successful defensive measures typically involved coordination between multiple communities and integration with Roman military forces, though such cooperation was often difficult to achieve given the competing interests and limited resources of local authorities. Saxon settlement patterns in the migration era reflect the dual nature of their activity, combining the preservation of traditional territories with the establishment of new bases in conquered or allied lands. Archaeological evidence suggests that core areas in Holstein and Westphalia remained inhabited throughout the migration period, serving as sources of reinforcement and supply for overseas operations. Concurrently, Saxon groups founded permanent settlements in Britain, northern Gaul, and other regions, where successful raids had revealed opportunities for colonization. The transformation of Saxon society during the migration period entailed fundamental shifts in social organization and cultural self-awareness that would have long-lasting consequences for their subsequent development. The traditional Confederate structure yielded to more centralized leadership under successful warlords. Simultaneously, the increased importance of maritime capabilities elevated the status of shipwrights, navigators, and other specialists essential for naval operations. The accumulation of wealth from raiding and the establishment of new territories created opportunities for social advancement that disrupted traditional hierarchies while reinforcing the importance of martial skill as the primary path to status and power. The systematic Saxon colonization of Britain resulted from the convergence of Rome's imperial weakness, internal British political fragmentation, and the accumulated maritime experience that Saxon retinues had honed over generations of raiding and mercenary service. By the mid-5th century, the withdrawal of Roman legions left the Romano-British elite struggling to maintain control over territories that had relied upon imperial military support for nearly 4 centuries. The collapse of the centralized Roman administration created a power vacuum that local British kings attempted to fill through a combination of diplomatic alliances, military recruitment, and territorial consolidation. It was within this context of political instability and military necessity that British rulers first invited Saxon warriors to serve as foederati, a decision destined to radically alter the demographic, cultural, and political landscape of post-Roman Britain. The traditional narrative of the arrival of Hengist and Horsa in 449 CE, preserved primarily in Bede's Ecclesiastical History and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, describes their invitation by the British King Vortigern as a response to growing pressure from Pictish and Scottish raids in the north. According to these sources, Vortigern ceded territory in Kent to the Saxon brothers in exchange for military service, providing them with warriors who arrived on 3 ships intended to serve as a buffer against northern threats. The narrative presents this agreement as a calculated political decision that initially benefited both parties. The Saxons gained land and provisions, while the Britons acquired experienced Germanic warriors familiar with the military techniques of their enemies. Archaeological evidence from Kent confirms the presence of significant Germanic settlement dating from the mid-5th century. Although material evidence suggests a more complex and multifaceted process than the traditional narrative implies, excavations at sites like Mucking and Weststow reveal substantial Saxon communities founded during this period. Settlement patterns indicate planned colonization rather than temporary military encampments. Ceramic assemblages from these sites demonstrate clear continuity with continental Saxon traditions, while incorporating local British elements, suggesting sustained contact with their ancestral lands and gradual adaptation to local conditions. Burial evidence from necropolies such as Fingalsham and Saga proves the establishment of fully formed communities, including women, children, and artisans, indicating permanent settlement rather than purely military occupation. Settlement patterns in Kent reveal a complex territorial organization that suggests coordinated planning, not random occupation. Saxon communities were typically situated on elevated ground, near river valleys, utilizing natural defensive positions while retaining access to transport routes and agricultural lands. The distribution of these settlements points to a systematic division of territory, with separate communities positioned at regular intervals, maximizing agricultural potential while ensuring mutual support in the event of external threats. The presence of high-status burials containing imported goods and richly adorned weaponry, archaeological discoveries suggest that, even in the early period, local aristocratic structures began to emerge among the Saxons' networks capable of coordinating activity across multiple settlements. The expansion of Saxon colonization beyond Kent into Sussex, Essex, and the Thames Valley followed a familiar pattern: strategic placement, gradual occupation, and steady consolidation of territory. In Sussex, evidence from Bishopston and Rookery Hill shows that Saxon settlers chose river valleys, natural arteries connecting the fertile inland to the coast. These communities displayed exceptional adaptability. They modified continental building techniques to suit local materials and environmental conditions, yet retained their essential cultural customs. Excavations reveal traces of craft workshops, smithies, potteries, and weaving huts, indicating that the local economy had moved beyond simple subsistence. Economic life diversified. Metalwork, ceramics, and textiles became key components of production. The rise of Wessex represents perhaps the most significant example of Saxon expansion. Archaeological data point to a systematic colonization of the Thames Valley and surrounding regions beginning in the late 5th century. At sites such as Dorchester-on-Thames, archaeologists have found evidence of large, well-organized settlements that included residential areas, artisanal quarters, and ritual spaces. Material culture from these sites reveals that while contact with the continent continued, a distinct local identity was taking shape, one that would later define the West Saxons. Weapon burials containing finely crafted spears, shields, and even swords attest to the persistence of a warrior ethos, even as agriculture and craft production expanded. Essex offers a different model of settlement. Here, Saxons interacted closely with the remaining Romano-British population. Finds from mucking display a fusion of Saxon pottery and metalwork with British construction practices. This pattern points not to displacement, but to cultural transformation. Saxon elites assuming control over existing administrative frameworks while preserving local traditions and communities. The Romano-British response to Saxon encroachment varied widely, from organized military campaigns to diplomatic negotiation. Historical sources highlight the figure of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Roman-educated aristocrat who organized effective resistance in the late 5th century. The historian Gildas describes him as a capable leader who rallied British forces, achieved notable victories, and for a time halted the Saxon advance, granting Britain several decades of relative peace. Campaigns associated with Ambrosius demonstrate how, under strong leadership, Romano-British communities could mobilize sophisticated defensive strategies. Archaeological evidence from Western hill forts reveals large-scale refortifications during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Forts rebuilt with both Roman engineering and innovations adapted to new military threats. Sites such as Cadbury Castle in Somerset show massive earthworks and traces of substantial garrisons, indicating well-coordinated defenses capable of challenging Saxon military power. Later, Arthurian legends, though heavily romanticized, likely preserve authentic memories of this resistance. Tales of a British war leader who defeated Saxon armies align with archaeological evidence for organized Romano-British opposition in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Excavations at Tintagel and Glastonbury, traditionally linked to Arthur, have uncovered remains of high-status occupation-imported Mediterranean amphorae and luxury goods, suggesting active trade networks and resources sufficient to sustain major military undertakings. The Battle of Baden Hill, described by Gildas as a decisive British victory that halted Saxon expansion for an entire generation, marked the high point of organized resistance. Though its exact location and date remain debated, the outcome appears clear. Saxon forces turned from conquest to consolidation. Archaeological trends of the early 6th century confirm this shift: fewer new settlements and a growing focus on internal development and agricultural intensification. The emergence of the early Saxon kingdoms represented a profound transformation from loose tribal confederations into structured political entities. In Kent, Sussex, Essex, and Wessex, rulers built institutions that combined Germanic traditions with adaptation to British realities. In Kent, under King Ethelbert, advanced legal codes and administrative systems were established, regulating both Saxon and British populations. The royal court attracted continental merchants and artisans, creating a cosmopolitan environment that encouraged cultural exchange and economic growth. Sussex, by contrast, developed along more martial lines. Archaeology suggests a militarized society focused on defense and territorial expansion. The South Saxon kings maintained close links with continental homelands. Imported Germanic goods and artistic styles appear in abundance. Rich weapon burials emphasize the continued prestige of the warrior class, while the distribution of elite settlements suggests a landscape organized more by military power than by bureaucratic governance. Essex, meanwhile, shows yet another model of evolution. Here, Saxons integrated with the surviving Romano-British administrative and economic framework. The East Saxon kings appear to have inherited Roman territorial divisions, maintaining towns such as London as trade and administrative hubs while extending control over surrounding farmland. Material culture from Essex reveals strong continuity with Romano-British traditions in pottery and building methods, evidence of synthesis rather than replacement. The assimilation of Celtic and Romano-British populations took different forms depending on local density, resources, and resistance. In Kent and Sussex, where Saxon colonization was most intensive, archaeological data show dramatic demographic change. Romano-British artifacts disappear within a few generations. Yet even in these regions, traces of the older culture survived in agriculture, place names, and religious practices that would later influence Saxon society. The Thames Valley presents a more nuanced picture. Evidence suggests long-term coexistence between Saxon and British communities throughout the 6th century. Excavations reveal settlements, where artifacts from both traditions lie side by side, signs of peaceful coexistence or gradual cultural blending rather than violent displacement. Mixed burials containing Saxon and British grave goods point to intermarriage and cultural exchange, giving rise to hybrid identities that combined elements of both worlds. Linguistic evidence reveals how profoundly the native British population influenced the evolution of Saxon culture, even in regions where Germanic settlement was most intense. The survival of Celtic river names, hill names, and place names across England reminds us that the descendants of the Britons remained present, passing on their local knowledge and traditions to the newcomers. Saxon farmers adopted many of the Britons' agricultural methods, soil cultivation, irrigation systems, and land management practices. These pragmatic borrowings became essential for survival and showed how cooperation with the native population helped the settlers adapt to their new environment. The religious landscape of this era was remarkably complex. 3 spiritual traditions coexisted and interacted: Germanic paganism, Romano-British Christianity, and Celtic belief systems. Burial customs discovered by archaeologists clearly reflect this blending. Weapons and pagan amulets often appear alongside crosses and Christian symbols. In many regions, ancient churches and sacred sites continued to function. This persistence suggests either a degree of tolerance from the new rulers or a gradual process of conversion, where older beliefs were not erased but reshaped within the framework of the new faith. The economy of Britain also underwent a profound transformation. The collapse of the Roman commercial network opened the way for new forms of exchange. The Saxons quickly integrated into continental trade, establishing markets, workshops, and systems of supply that linked the North Sea region into a single economic sphere. Archaeologists have uncovered remains of specialized production centers for metalworking, pottery, and weaving that supplied wide areas and maintained active connections across the sea. Imported goods, from jewelry to fine ceramics, confirm that post-Roman Britain was far from isolated. It remained deeply engaged in the broader commercial world. While their kin across the sea were founding kingdoms in Britain, the continental Saxons, those dwelling along the Weser and Elbe, faced an entirely different challenge. The rise of the Frankish power under the Carolingians turned their homeland into the last great pagan stronghold of Western Europe. When Charlemagne's armies began their incursions, the Saxons still clung to their ancient gods, assemblies of free men, and the independence that had preserved them through centuries after Rome's fall. Yet what had once been their strength, a decentralized tribal order, now became their weakness. Against Charlemagne's disciplined and organized empire, Saxon independence stood little chance. Their territories stretched from the Rhine to the Elbe, encompassing the valleys of the Meuse, the Weser, and numerous tributaries. They were inhabited by 3 major tribal groups: the Westphalians, the Angrians, and the Eastphalians. Each maintained its own assemblies, military leadership, and sacred sites, creating a landscape rich in local autonomy but lacking central authority, a structure that made collective resistance difficult. Religion gave Saxon defiance its deeper meaning. Their lands contained some of the most important pagan shrines in the north, most notably the Irminsul, a massive wooden pillar symbolizing the axis of the world, linking earth and heaven. It stood at Eresburg, and drew pilgrims from across the Germanic world. Excavations suggest that this sanctuary had been revered for centuries. Ritual offerings and votive deposits testify to continuous worship and a shared sense of sacred identity. Charlemagne understood that destroying such sanctuaries was as crucial as winning battles. His campaign of 772 began with a direct assault on Eresburg, where the Irminsul stood. The site was captured and destroyed, sending shockwaves through Saxon society. The failure of their gods to defend their holiest shrine undermined faith in divine protection. The Frankish army that entered Saxony was the most advanced military machine of its time. Its core consisted of heavy cavalry, mailed warriors armed with spears and swords, supported by infantry, engineers, and siege specialists. Against such forces, the Saxon infantry could not prevail in open combat. After the destruction of the Irminsul, Charlemagne launched a campaign of religious eradication. Sacred groves, springs, and shrines were burned, and churches or monasteries were built on their ruins to proclaim the triumph of Christianity. This spiritual conquest proved as devastating as the military one. The sight of destroyed sanctuaries eroded the Saxons' belief in their ancestral gods. The most prominent leader of Saxon resistance was Widukind of Westphalia, a charismatic figure who succeeded in uniting several tribes under his command. Under his leadership, the Saxons fought a guerrilla war, striking supply lines, garrisons, and Christian settlements before retreating into forests. These well-coordinated attacks reveal a sophisticated intelligence network and show that Saxon political organization, though battered, remained remarkably resilient. Governing the conquered territory proved even more difficult for Charlemagne than subduing it. The Saxon population resisted through sabotage, tax evasion, and passive defiance. Frankish officials lacked local understanding, and the need to maintain large garrisons drained imperial resources. Around 785, Charlemagne issued the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a legal code that made Christianity mandatory and punished pagan rituals, refusal of baptism, and even unauthorized assemblies with death. The law aimed not merely to convert, but to dismantle the foundations of Saxon society, its communal gatherings, legal traditions, and customary justice. The decree also imposed church tithes, forcing the Saxons to finance the very institution that was eradicating their culture. Mass deportations followed. Entire villages were relocated to distant regions of the empire, while Frankish colonists took their place. Archaeological evidence shows abandoned settlements with domestic items left behind, proof of forced expulsion. These new settlers brought their own agricultural techniques and social models, gradually transforming the landscape and erasing traces of the old order. The most infamous episode of Charlemagne's Saxon Wars came in 782, when approximately 4,500 Saxon captives were executed at Verdun after surrendering. The massacre horrified contemporaries. Warfare had ceased to be a contest of valor and had become an act of annihilation. Yet rather than cowing the Saxons, it reignited rebellion. Widukind returned to arms, and the population, realizing that surrender offered no safety, rose again. Despite years of devastation, Saxon resistance endured. Coordinated uprisings swept across the land, targeting garrisons and Christian centers, briefly restoring independence. But exhaustion took its toll. Crafts declined, populations shrank, and dependence on Frankish goods deepened. By the mid-780s, resistance faltered. The capture and baptism of Widukind in 785 symbolized the end of organized opposition. Contemporary sources describe the event not as a conversion of faith, but as a political compromise. Widukind was promised safety and limited authority in exchange for loyalty to the Frankish crown. With the integration of Saxony into the Carolingian Empire, a new administrative and ecclesiastical order arose. Bishoprics were founded in Bremen, Minden, and other centers, serving both religious and educational purposes. These institutions gradually shaped a Christian, literate society aligned with imperial norms. The consequences of Charlemagne's conquest extended far beyond the battlefield. The destruction of Saxon paganism eradicated the last major non-Christian system in Western Europe. Yet the incorporation of Saxony into the empire bound northern Europe to the rest of the continent through trade, communication, and culture. Some elements of Saxon customary law survived within the Carolingian framework, preserving fragments of Germanic legal tradition within the fabric of the new Christian civilization. The conquest of the Saxons by Charlemagne, which had seemed the final end of the pagan age, in fact, marked the beginning of a new cycle of transformation. From the ashes of destroyed sanctuaries and the loss of ancient freedoms, a different Saxony slowly arose, Christian, literate, and politically aware. Forced baptisms, mass deportations, and Frankish garrisons scattered across the land only silenced resistance for a time. They could not extinguish the spirit of a people hardened for centuries by the northern winds of Germany. The first decades after Widukind's capitulation were years of contradiction. Outwardly, Saxony was integrated into the Carolingian system of rule, yet within it remained restless and divided. The new bishoprics of Minden, Hildesheim, and Bremen became the strongholds of cultural reconstruction. Within their walls, Latin literacy and Christian doctrine slowly replaced older sacred traditions. Among the common folk, however, pagan customs lingered: rites of fertility, veneration of sacred groves, and devotion to household spirits. Even 2 generations after Widukind, archaeology reveals signs of dual faith: crosses found beside Thor's hammers, and solar emblems engraved on grave ornaments. Charlemagne and his successors understood that Saxony could not be held by force alone. Gradually, military rule gave way to integration. Frankish administrators drew the local nobility into imperial service by granting titles, lands, and participation in governance. From former tribal chieftains emerged a new aristocracy: Saxon counts, bound to the emperor by oath and fief. Thus, from the ruins of the tribal order arose the feudal structure that by the 9th century would define the German world. At the same time, cultural transformation unfolded. Monasteries founded by missionaries from Frankish and Irish lands quickly became centers of learning and artistry. The Corvey Abbey, established by disciples of St. Willibald, gained special prominence. Its scriptorium forged the Latin literacy of northern Germany, producing not only liturgical texts, but also chronicles that recorded Saxon history from a Christian perspective. By the mid-9th century, the conversion of Saxony was no longer a mere formality. Stone churches replaced wooden shrines. Church festivals, aligned with old agricultural cycles, gave traditional rites new meaning. Beneath the surface of Christian symbolism, however, still glowed the pagan reverence for nature, fate, and honor. The Saxons had accepted Christ, yet they retained their blunt strength, their endurance, and their devotion to communal justice, traits that would soon make them the backbone of a new German realm. After Charlemagne's death, the empire fragmented among his heirs, and Saxony found itself on the margins of power. The weakening of central authority allowed local nobles to strengthen their positions. While the Frankish provinces were torn by feuds, the northern lands began to form stable ducal houses. Chief among them was the line of the Ludelfings, descendants of a Westphalian count, who succeeded in uniting scattered counties and reviving a shared Saxon identity. At the same time, external threats grew. From the late 8th century onward, new waves of attacks swept across the North Sea coasts, this time not Saxon, but Viking. The Norse raiders burned monasteries and trading towns, plundering the routes along the Weser and Elbe, deep into Saxony. Yet unlike earlier times, the Saxons met them not as pagan brethren, but as Christians defending their churches and lands. This struggle against the northern seafarers became a test of maturity for the new Saxon nation. Together with the Franks and Thuringians, they began constructing a chain of fortifications, boors, around monasteries and rivers. Some, such as Hildesheim and Bremen, grew into prototypes of future cities. Out of the ruins of conquest and subjugation rose the first shoots of a new civilization, one that fused Germanic strength with Christian order. By the 9th century, Saxony had transformed from a conquered frontier into one of the pillars of the Carolingian Empire. A distinct social order emerged here, austere, disciplined, yet inwardly independent. The monasteries spread the teachings of the Church, but they also became bastions of local authority. Their walls served simultaneously as schools, fortresses, and centers of production. The lands granted to churches and new counts formed a dense network of estates bound by military and spiritual allegiance to the emperor. Among the Saxon nobility, a new ideal of rule began to take shape. Power exercised not over men, but for the sake of order. Unlike the Frankish barons, who viewed their fiefs as private wealth, the Saxon lords still saw themselves primarily as protectors of the community. Their authority rested on the ancient traditions of the thing assemblies and collective consent, reinterpreted in a Christian sense. This gave Saxony unique political weight. It became a land where the old Germanic freedom merged with the Roman principle of law. While the Western Carolingians fell into chaos and fraternal wars, consolidation advanced in the East. By the mid-9th century, a new entity had taken shape on Saxon soil, the Duchy of Saxony, united under the House of Ludolfing. The family descended from Count Ludolf of Westphalia, whose vast estates around Osnabrück and Hildesheim became the nucleus of their power. His son, Otto the Illustrious, succeeded in turning this patrimony into a center of northern German unity. Under Ludolfing leadership, Saxony experienced renewal. Cities destroyed in the Viking Age were rebuilt, monasteries revived, and the trade routes of the Weser and Elbe once again linked the north and south of the empire. Yet with prosperity came a new self-awareness. The Saxons had grown too strong to remain vassals. By the early 10th century, the Carolingian dynasty, weakened by internal strife, could no longer control its eastern provinces. In 911, after the death of the last East Frankish ruler, Charles the Simple, the throne effectively stood vacant. The German dukes elected Conrad I of Franconia, but his authority was fragile. The Saxon duke, Otto the Illustrious, and his son, Henry the Fowler, held far greater real power, commanding the richest lands, the strongest fortresses, and the most loyal armies. When Conrad died in 918, he recognized the inevitable and, on his deathbed, entrusted the royal insignia to Henry, opening a new chapter in German history. Thus, Saxony, once considered a rebellious province, gave Europe a new ruler. Henry the Fowler, 919–936, the first king of the Saxon dynasty. Henry inherited a kingdom torn by division and threatened on all sides. From the west came Frankish rivals, from the south the Hungarians, whose swift cavalry ravaged the land, and from the north still came occasional Norse raiders. Yet from this chaos, Henry forged a system that would define German politics for centuries. He declined the imperial title and avoided the pomp of Roman coronations, focusing instead on reforming his realm. His cornerstone innovation was a network of burhs, fortified settlements across Saxony. Each burh contained a garrison, supplies, and a permanent population. In times of danger, surrounding villagers could seek refuge within its walls. This system not only protected the realm from Hungarian invasions, but also laid the foundation for German urban life. Around the burhs grew markets, craft quarters, and monasteries. Thus, from the necessities of defense, a new urban civilization was born. Henry also pursued diplomacy. He made peace with Duke Wenceslaus of Bohemia, maintained relations with the Danes, and turned his gaze eastward, toward the Slavic lands beyond the Elbe. There he began the long process of conquest and Christianization that his successors would continue. When Henry died in 936, he left to his son Otto not a fractured kingdom, but a structured realm. A web of cities, castles, and vassal loyalties knit together by duty and law. Otto ascended the throne at a time when Germany was just beginning to perceive itself as a single political organism. His coronation in Aachen symbolized continuity, for it was there that Charlemagne had once ruled. Yet Otto was no mere heir of the Carolingians. He understood that power in the New Age required not only the sword, but also the word. His reign became an alliance between throne and altar. He bound the church to the crown by granting bishops and abbots vast estates, while keeping them under royal control. Thus arose the unique institution of the imperial church, Reichskirche, the cornerstone of Saxon monarchy and the spiritual arm of royal authority. When Henry the Fowler passed away, his son Otto Thront, the Great, inherited not merely a kingdom, but the foundation of a new European civilization. His reign became the bridge linking the age of tribes and raids with that of empires and literacy. In Otto's person, the stern strength of the Saxon sword found political grandeur and spiritual justification. Otto continued his father's work, but elevated it to a higher level. His first task was to secure authority over the powerful duchies, whose rulers, semi-independent in earlier generations, now had to acknowledge royal supremacy. He ruled not only by the sword, but through insight, exploiting rivalries among nobles, rewarding loyalty, and forging peace through marriage alliances. Yet when diplomacy failed, steel decided. The defining trial of his reign came with the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where Otto crushed the Hungarian hordes that had ravaged Europe for decades. This victory marked the rebirth of German strength. The continent regained a sense of safety, and Otto's name became synonymous with the savior of Christendom. For the first time in centuries, the German kings saw themselves as heirs to Rome's mission, guardians of order and faith. In 962, Otto journeyed to Italy and was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope. That coronation completed a cycle that had begun with Charlemagne's conquest of the Saxons. The once subjugated people now stood at the helm of the empire, whose roots reached back to antiquity. Upon the old pagan frontier had risen a new center of Christian power. Otto's empire was not only a political creation, but a cultural and spiritual one. At his courts in Magdeburg and Quedlinburg, a Saxon Renaissance took form, a fusion of classical heritage, Christian learning, and northern discipline. Monasteries such as Corvey, Hildesheim, and Fulda became beacons of scholarship and artistry. Their scriptoria produced illuminated manuscripts where gold intertwined with Germanic ornament, and biblical stories found expression through the severe beauty of the Saxon aesthetic. Under Otto, the empire's philosophy was born, a union of sword and prayer. Bishops became both spiritual shepherds and imperial administrators. Church and crown fused into one system of authority, where the sacred and the temporal no longer stood apart. Yet the grandeur of the empire did not erase its roots. The Saxon lands remained the cradle of ancient virtues, independence, diligence, and warrior honor. Village assemblies still gathered as things, resolving disputes according to ancestral custom. On saints' feast days, old songs echoed, carrying memories of Widukind and the first defenders of the land. Otto the Great saw kingship as service, not dominion. His vision rested on the idea of universal order, a hierarchy in which every people of the empire, whether Saxon, Frank, Swabian, Bavarian, or Slav, had its rightful place. He sought unity through justice, not through fear, and thus laid the groundwork for a new type of European state, an empire of law rather than blood. After Otto's death in 973, his dynasty held the throne for several generations. His son Otto II and grandson Otto III continued the legacy, moving the imperial ideal from military conquest to spiritual renewal. Otto III dreamed of reviving a Christian Rome, a synthesis of German discipline and Latin culture, where faith would become the common foundation of Europe. Meanwhile, in Saxony itself, life turned toward building rather than war. Cities fortified their walls, crafts flourished, and trade connected the North Sea with the Alps. Monasteries served as both spiritual and economic centers, while Saxon agriculture, rooted in ancient tradition, sustained the empire's prosperity. Beneath these new forms, however, the old Saxon spirit endured. The people who had once risen against Charlemagne now carried the cross and the sword of the empire, yet they never lost their inner will. Their severity, discipline, and sense of communal justice became the backbone of the German state for centuries. By the mid-10th century, Saxony had transformed from a wild northern frontier into the spiritual and political heart of Europe. Here, a new idea was born: the reconciliation of faith and power, of tradition and law, of personal honor and imperial responsibility. Thus ended a journey that had begun among the swamps and oak forests of ancient Germany. A people forged by wind and hardship had endured conquest, conversion, and transformation, only to emerge as the architects of medieval Europe. Though the name of the Saxons would eventually dissolve into that of kingdoms and provinces, their spirit, resolute, proud, and searching, remained woven into the fabric of European history. It resounds in the stone vaults of Magdeburg Cathedral, in the chants of monks, in the codes of law written under the Ottonians, and in the very idea of an empire where strength serves reason and power obeys duty.